Well, welcome everybody to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We are in our second conversation looking at the letter of First Thessalonians. Last time we looked at how the church in Thessalonica,
Yep.
was like, they had like a 3-week crash course with Paul.
Yeah.
And
Yet, three weeks of Bible school.
Yep. Yet that word was functioning in them so powerfully because Jesus was working in them that they became this church that was resilient through the suffering that they had to go through because of the local persecution. Mm-hmm. And Paul is writing to them, thanking God for the word that's been at work within them. And we kind of talked a little bit about how suffering advances the gospel, and we also talked about how it's God working in us that really sanctifies and transforms us and makes us resilient through suffering. And now today we're going to be talking about the coming of the Lord.
Among other things.
Yeah,
Paul,
I think you can tell I'm just excited about one thing.
You could tell everybody's excited about one thing at the end of First Thessalonians. But Paul, after praying for 3 chapters, kind of pivots, and he has 3 major categories of teaching he wants to talk to his the Thessalonians about, and he wants them to be sanctified. He says, this is God's will for your life, that you would be sanctified, which is really interesting.
Which just means holy.
Which means, becoming more holy.
Yeah, which then just means becoming like God.
Yes,
right?
Becoming more like Jesus as he acted
Leviticus said, be holy as I am holy.
Be sanctified, be holy,
which means look like me.
That's right.
Do the things I do, live the way I live, think the things I think.
Yes.
And so the process of becoming holy is sanctification. They actually have the same root word.
That's right.
It's holification.
Holification.
Yeah. Okay.
Becoming more like God.
He wants them to be sanctified?
In particularly 3 areas.
Okay.
One concerning their sex lives.
Oh. All right. Here we go.
Another concerning their work ethic.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, concerning their grief. What does it mean to be grieve in a way that accords with the resurrected Christ?
Okay.
Yeah, and those are the 3 things that he talks about.
All right.
And he folds in the talk of the coming of the Lord in his exhortation, in his teaching to them about how to become holy as it relates to grief.
Okay. These seem like random topics.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to put them together because last time we talked about how Timothy, they had to so Paul and Silas had to flee Thessalonica whenever the Jewish persecution broke out, so they didn't get to stay and teach the church as long as they wanted to. And so Paul sends Timothy back to the church to hear news of how things are going in Thessalonica, and Timothy reports back that 1, even though they're suffering, they're staying faithful and it's growing. 2, that some rumors have been spreading that Paul and Silas were just there teaching for money. And we talked about both of those last time.
Yeah.
But then the third thing we talked about was there are just some deficiencies in what Paul was able to teach them in the time that they had.
Yeah.
And he needs to come back and address those. Is that kind of the category to put that in? Or?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So what's really interesting about the book of First Thessalonians is that it contains several uses of the phrase, as I've already told you, or I have no need to teach you about, or I mentioned previously that. And so Paul, in most of these cases, is reminding them of things he's already taught them.
When he was with them.
Yep. And he's just offering further encouragement along those lines.
Okay.
And I think 2 examples will be helpful here to emphasize why he's doing that. So he brings up in his work ethic section a command to not be idle, to work hard as he and Silas worked hard. They were, worked a day job so they wouldn't be a burden to anybody else.
Oh, right,
And some people in Thessalonica were not working hard and taking advantage of the generosity of others by not working. So he's like, you shouldn't do that. And he says that in his first letter, and he mentions that he said that to them personally while he was there on the ground. And then in 2 Thessalonians, that issue comes up again, and it gets an entire chapter.
Okay.
So there seems to be a problem that he was not able to get to the root of while he was on the ground in Thessalonica.
He addressed it, but it went deeper.
Timothy says, this is still a problem. You should address it again. He addresses it again. And then by the time the second letter rolls around, it's such a problem that he spends a whole chapter discussing it.
Okay.
And another one would have been another example. It's a smaller example. At the very end of chapter 5, Paul just gives 14 rapid fire commands. Rejoice always, do all these things, right? And one of them is to test and judge prophecies well. And one of the things that he mentions in 2 Thessalonians is that there have been prophecies that have come up that have contradicted Paul.
Ah.
So they failed to test prophecies accurately.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what's happening is here. He's reminding these new believers of things he's already taught them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there are some gaps in their knowledge.
That's right. And Timothy's reporting on that to Paul, and Paul's addressing that in his letter.
That's right.
Okay,
That's
that
right.
makes sense. So
And-
yeah,
But why the randomness of these things?
right?
But I think on another level, it's like, what's more perennial and global in scope than sex, work, and death?
I mean,
Yeah, it's like these things. Like, these are
true.
like the things of human living.
yeah, that's
and it's
true.
like, what should you do with your body,
what should you do with your money and your effort?
and what should you do
When people die.
When people die,
Yeah,
like these.
that's true. They're very big issues.
So it's
That's
like,
fair.
So it's like, in some sense, they don't feel exactly random either.
Yeah, they're core issues that will come up when somebody converts from the kingdom of the world to the kingdom of heaven.
Right, because everybody has an opinion about
Right.
what you should do, how you should have sex, and what your work ethic should be,
Yeah.
and what happens when you die.
What to do with your body, your money, and your dead.
Yes, these are like
Okay.
everybody. Like these are basic discipleship 101.
Okay, that's helpful. And
yeah.
the other side of it is we're only getting one half of the conversation.
That's right.
Is like they had a history. They had spent hours and hours and hours and hours together teaching, asking questions, learning about each other's lives, and now Timothy's telling him everything that's going on. And he's just writing the other side of the conversation. And so
That's right.
what might seem random to us is actually very pastoral and calculated on Paul's side.
That's right.
Okay, cool. Let's jump in. Where do you want to start?
So let's talk about sex,
Baby.
baby. Chapter 4, verse 1. Finally, then, brothers, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus that as you receive from us how you ought to walk and to please God, just as you are already doing, that you do so more and more. For you know what instructions we gave you through the Lord Jesus. So he's just saying, keep doing what you're doing.
Yep.
You already know everything we taught you. This is the will of God, your sanctification.
Right.
You are becoming more holy. And in particular, let's start off with that you abstain from sexual immorality. That each one of you learns to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion or lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. So referring to their pagan, Grecian, Thessalonican culture. And no one transgress and wrong his brother and sister in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger in all these things, as we told you before and solemnly warned you. So apparently, I think much of Greece, and Thessalonica in particular, was known for its sexually permissive lifestyle that favored men's expression of sexual pleasure
Right.
at the expense of those of lower social classes than them.
That's right.
So what he's pointing out here is like, okay, you're Christians now. You don't act like the gods of the Greeks.
Right. Who
You
were
act-
always committing incest and
Doing all sorts
all
of things
kinds
with
of terrible
humans.
things and
You act like the God of the Bible.
yeah.
You control yourself not for taking advantage of other people, but for
Yeah, you don't use your body to take advantage of other people below your station. You use the facilities of your body to serve and bless those. And it's like, yeah, you were called to purity, not impurity.
yes, you're called to holiness.
Holiness.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And then related to this, he says this. Therefore, he says, now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anybody to write you. So it's interesting. He stacks all these commands about proper use of your body during sex and
Right.
tacks it on to commands about brotherly love. And he says, you're already doing the brotherly love part really well. You have no need for anyone to write you about this, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. So apparently what was happening is not only were some of the men in Thessalonica just not educated enough or convicted enough of a biblical way of using their bodies in sex and taking advantage of other people as they were used to doing. They were also some group of people there who were taking advantage of the generosity of others, being dependent on the generosity of others, and not working hard for others' benefit. Does that make sense? Does that connection make sense? Some men were taking
Yes.
advantage of people sexually. Other people were taking advantage of others financially.
Yep.
And he's addressing them both at the same moment. He says,
Yep.
these are both related to love, brotherly love, affectionate love, and you should not be doing either of these things. God
that
is
makes
not a
sense.
God who takes advantage of people.
Right. It's
Right.
like, you guys are doing great in the brotherly love thing. Let me add one bit of nuance to it. Real brotherly Christ-like love does not take advantage of others.
That's right.
It doesn't harm others.
That's right.
Yeah. Whether through sex or economy.
That's right.
Okay, that makes sense. One thing I've heard before, I'm curious if you stumbled on this as you were studying, was that these actually go together.
Yes.
And he might be referencing some kind of vassal or household servant or something.
That's exactly right. However, we had a really hard time finding out that particular situation behind the scenes. So that could have been the case. That's an easy way. You can read that into this pretty easily.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably just easier to say, like, there were some people who were underworking
Yeah.
and taking advantage of others' generosity. And there were other people who were taking advantage of people sexually. And Paul says neither of those things accord with brotherly love. And let's center on holiness. Let's be holy as God is holy. Let's be sanctified in this matter. Work with your hands, pay for your own stuff, be generous to other people, and then don't take advantage of people just because of your higher social station and demand sexual acts from them when that's not the way that God has designed sex or marriage to look.
Yeah. And he also talks about doing that like in front of outsiders, right? I think you mentioned that.
Verse 12, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and to be dependent on no one.
So it's like Paul, like you said, was not dependent on the church when he was there. Right. He worked night and day so that he wouldn't be dependent. And he did that as a testimony to those that he was witnessing to. And so it seems like he's asking the Thessalonians to mirror that.
That's right.
To be dependent on no one so that those who are watching see something unique in that way of living.
Yep.
And are called to
what
you're doing. So it's like, I was trying to find a connection point to the rest of the letter. You know?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, your suffering is a testimony, right? To everybody around Macedonia. It's spreading, it's changing your whole civilization. And now also the way that you manage your sexuality and the way that you manage your economy, like your money and your work, both of those can be testimonies too. Both of those can impact and influence the world around you as well.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. He's giving them more weapons for the battle that they're in.
Yeah. If you go down, just skip down to chapter 5, verse 12, he expands on these commands a little bit more. He says this: so we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. So apparently there were a class of people, potentially the leaders of the church, who had acted like Paul and Silas. They were working hard and being generous with other people and serving others by leading them well and perhaps even providing for them when they needed help. So that's why he's saying you should honor and esteem them, right? And we urge you, brothers, to admonish the idle and encourage the faint-hearted and help the weak and be patient with them all. So see that no one repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, giving thanks in all circumstances. So it seems as if these commands are talking to the commands that we have just read in chapter 4. And all of those commands would be a very clear indication to outsiders of a different kind of community.
A holy community.
One
that looks like God.
That respects their elders, who works hard. They support each other when they need it. They celebrate and rejoice even when they're suffering, who are doing good to the faint-hearted when they could have otherwise just cast them out. This picture of a community is really compelling to the Thessalonican culture.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it makes me think of two things, like, because I always want to get to like the why, why is he talking about this? And it's like, well, don't do that so you don't go to hell. That's not his driving force here. He's doing it for holiness, and obviously also we've been talking about that it would be a witness that the Grecian culture that they're permeated in mirrors their Grecian gods, who are promiscuous and licentious and probably favor males over females, and it can get abusive. And so he's like, let's image God, right, in a community that images Grecian gods.
Yeah.
And let's create a different community, a separate community, a holy community that shows the rest of your neighbors what God is like
Yeah.
by how you manage your finances and how you use your body.
Yeah. Verse 7 of chapter 4 says this: "For God has not called us to impurity, but in holiness." And I think that kind of like sums up everything that you're trying to say here. They were copying the gods that they knew, copying the gods of the Greco-Roman myths that frequently took advantage of people, frequently had sex with people they shouldn't have, frequently abused people. And they were acting as they saw in their the myths of their popular culture. They were acting like the gods. But there's another God who doesn't act that way. And how does this relate to the conversation? Well, what is God like? He's a generous God who gives effusively, and he's also a God who self-sacrifices in order that others may prosper.
Right.
And his blessing generally tends towards creativity. It's generative. It creates things. So how are they using sex? In ways that doesn't create life.
Destructive ways.
In destructive ways.
Right.
It's more about pleasure than it is about bringing new image bearers of God in the world. They are not being generous. They're being stingy and selfish. So they should image the God of the Bible,
right,
instead of imaging the gods, the pagan Roman culture.
Yeah, which he said a couple times was his goal in chapters 1 and 2. He's like, be imitators.
That's right.
He's like, it's all about being imitators of Christ.
And in chapter 1, he says, the whole world knows how you've been turning away from idols to serve the living and true God.
Yeah.
They're in the process of turning away from all the idols of Thessalonica to the image of God.
Yes.
And here are two more ways to continue that path forward.
Yeah. I just think it's such a helpful thing to camp on for a second, like we have been, to talk about the why behind Christian morality. Because I think so much of it can just be either, well, because God said so,
right,
or because you don't want to be a sinner and suffer a sinner's reward, or there's all the, it's like the reason we do it is, I mean, one, because it's the healthy, wise way to live in the world, right? Like God made the world a certain way, and we live with the universe's grain when we follow the Creator. But what he's harping on here is a Christian morality is one of the best witnesses to the world of what God is like. It's a picture of who God is. So picture God, show him to the world, image him, bear his image to the world. Yeah. And the world will see God and be changed.
One of the side effects of following God is that the world is compelled to follow God too. Right. One of the side effects of imaging God in our sex, in our money, and in our grief is that the world is compelled to follow the God that we serve as well.
Yeah. It just couches it completely differently. The other thing that I was thinking about with these moral commands was he talked about in chapter 4, verse 2, I think, or 1. 1. He says that you ought to walk and to please God. That when you were reading that earlier, it just stuck out to me because I sometimes I think about displeasing God, which is not being said here necessarily, but it's like that I could actually be a pleasure to God, that God could enjoy, that God enjoys my life, like that the way I image him actually makes him smile. Yeah, and I mean, one of my favorite things, like for a friend, that I'm hosting at my house, or for my wife or my children, is when I do something that just makes them laugh or smile or have a moment with like a bite of food or something that's just like, oh man, that was pleasing. And like, that was one of my favorite things to do, is to please someone, because it's just so life-giving. It's so joy-making. And the fact that I could do that to the Creator of the world, that I could live in a way that actually fills God with pleasure, it's fascinating.
The way the Old Testament talks about that is that when sacrifices are offered in the temple, the smoke of the sacrifices goes up, and it's described as a pleasing aroma to God. So like barbecue always smells great.
This is true.
So like God is accepting an animal sacrifice, and he is accepted as a pleasing aroma, something that's enjoyable to him. And so I think that's probably that pleasing God language is a callback, a hyperlink to this old sacrificial language. And so what's interesting is these people are not offering sacrifices, but they're making sacrifices out of their lives.
That's right.
they're the barbecue. Right. They
are the living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to
right,
God.
that like God inhales and sees like, this is a good thing. This is the way I hope for my people to be.
Which is ultimately what Jesus was. He was the sacrifice that was pleasing to God. Not only because, and it's not just that God really enjoys sacrifice. That's not what we're saying here. It's that in Jesus' death on the cross and in Christians pursuing a holy life, God looks at that and he says, that's what I look like. Right? Like that's a mirror to me, the most beautiful, holy, gorgeous thing in all of the universe. And whenever we mirror God, he's like, yes, you're starting to look like me. That's what I look like. And he takes pleasure in it because we are filling up and displaying and embodying the best thing in the world, which is himself.
And I think the thing that Paul points out explicitly here is in verse 5. He says, don't take advantage of other people when it comes to sex, and then don't take advantage of people when it comes to finances. Because why? Verse 6, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as we told you before and solemnly warned you. The part of the good news here is not simply that we please God by our willingness to like accept his moral commands in our life, but it's also that when Jesus comes, he comes to do justice against those who take advantage of others and who do so maliciously and abusively. Jesus comes solemnly to deal severe justice to those who misuse their body and their lives to the detriment and harm of others.
Right.
And that's going to be a pretty significant theme that's picked up in the next verses.
Yeah. Before we jump there, one last thing, just because I think you've nailed something really important about there's this avenging that God is going to bring, against those who are breaking his moral commands so that they are harming others.
Yeah.
And I think for the Christians in Thessalonica and for us today, we can feel like it's our job to respond to that moral brokenness. But in a lot of times when we do that, we end up breaking God's moral commands in the process.
We want to be the harbingers of justice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why he's like, hey, don't repay anyone for evil. Like, don't repay evil for evil. Always just seek to do good to everyone, even those who are doing the wrong thing or wrong things against you. You know what? Instead of complaining and yelling at them and throwing it in their face, rejoice, pray, give thanks. And it's like, so I wonder, I don't know, I'm probably overreaching here, but it's like, I do wonder if, the suffering Christians receiving the generosity of others are like, you know what? I am just going to idle out right now because life's hard.
Yeah.
I'm being persecuted and I'm just going to not have to also work. Like that just is a lot.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I'm going to do that because it's like, I'm sticking it to somebody. I'm not going to go to my pagan boss's job and work for him anymore because I don't have to, and you're like trying to stick it to him. I'm curious. I'm reaching.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very human thing to be like, when I'm wronged, I want to lash out in some way by underperforming or anxiously trying to get even in some way.
Right.
And he's like, no, God will judge those things. Yeah. He'll take care of those things.
You continue to work, you continue to give, you continue to pray, be thankful, repay evil with good. And in that you're continuing to image God. Like that is holiness. We were evil toward God and God repaid that evil with the ultimate good. That's right. By coming to us in his son and sacrificing for us. So, anyway, that's pretty cool. Okay. So those are like two of the moral commands. Or did we do three?
We've only done two because the third one is about death and grief.
That's right. Okay.
Death and grief.
Okay. Death
and this grief is one of the first places that we enter into a conversation Paul did not have an opportunity to address the Thessalonians beforehand. So he starts off chapter 4, verse 13, but we do not want you to be uninformed about those who fall asleep.
And that's people who die.
That's people who die. That's right. So presumably Timothy came back to Paul after his visit to Thessalonica and he said, hey, they had a question for you about the people who die.
About what happens when a Christian dies.
That's right. And so he's like, okay, let me talk to you about something that we didn't get a chance to cover in our 3 weeks of Bible school. And this is what he says. So we don't want you to be uninformed about those who are asleep, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. So the point of this is to give what does it mean to be a Christian who believes in a resurrected Jesus to grieve well?
Yeah.
How do Christians who believe in resurrection grieve those who have died?
Right. Because it's a different thing for us. We believe in life after death.
That's right.
But also, if your like Christian friends, like mother dies, you're not gonna be like, hey, don't worry about it.
That's
like,
right.
That's not a good way to grieve either.
That's right.
So what's a Christian response?
That's
to Christian
exactly right.
death?
And presumably what's happening behind the scenes here is that Timothy isn't just reporting a general question about death, but a specific question about death.
Okay, and what's that?
They've been suffering
Right.
under this persecution, and some of the members of their fledgling church have died at the hands of either the Jewish or the Thessalonican authorities because of their faith. And so like what happens to these brothers and sisters who have just died for their faith in Jesus Christ?
Right.
What's going to happen to them, especially in light of the fact that you told us that Jesus is coming soon, which is a whole nother thing that we haven't got into yet. But
because the last time I heard about somebody dying for faith in God in this way, it was Jesus, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. Is that what we should expect? Like, I wonder what all they're thinking. Yeah,
so here we go. So we don't want you to grieve as others do, because since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, though Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. So the point here is simply like, we know that Jesus died and rose again, which means that anyone who has died will rise again too. That's the very general point here.
Through Jesus. Because he defeated death and has, and I don't know how to word that, but knows how to bring life out of death.
That's right. And we declare this to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. So a lot's going on there.
Yeah.
Right? Let's start with the most basic things.
Okay.
Whatever this means, it's meant to encourage these believers and to help them to grieve in light of resurrection. Like, that's what this is meant to do.
Yeah.
And it says, you're worried that because some of your friends who believed in Jesus died before the coming of the Lord, you're afraid they've somehow missed out on Jesus' coming. And he's like, you don't need to worry about that.
He's going to raise them.
Jesus died and rose, so he will raise those dead friends of yours from the dead. And together, one day, we will join God in the air and be with him forever. We'll be with God forever.
Yeah.
You don't need to worry that your friends who have died before you will miss out on the coming of Jesus in majesty and power and glory.
That's such like it's such like an obvious thing, I think, to a lot of Christians today, because we've been separated from the coming of Jesus for so many generations now, where millions of Christians have died, and we're not like, well, I guess they all missed it, because only the ones alive when Jesus comes are gonna be able to hang out with him, because they're alive. Everybody else is dead. Right. And it's just it's funny in a way. Yeah, but it makes total sense.
Right. Like, of course you'd be.
If you were living in that time when resurrection life wasn't like a normal category in your worldview, you'd be like, oh crap, they're dead.
They're dead forever.
They're dead forever, and Jesus comes and they missed out.
Greek philosophy did not hold out for personal resurrection. There would have been no real analog for the Christian hope that dead people are united with living people and experience the same victory of Jesus at the same, together.
Especially a bodily resurrection.
That's right.
The duality that was in, Grecian Platonism was like body bad, soul, spirit good. And so if anything was going to continue on, it would be a spirit thing, but not a resurrection on earth where Jesus would come back. That would make no sense. Why would you want that old bad body? Yeah. And, Christianity redeems that in the glorified body of Jesus' resurrection and puts the duality into a unified form. So, yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so they're worried that they're waiting on the return of the Lord, on the coming of the Lord. But some of their own have died, and they're like, oh no, when Jesus comes back, they're going to miss out. And he's like, no, don't worry about it. When Jesus comes back, or when at the coming of the Lord, I'm trying to use his words, at the coming of the Lord, the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are left will join them in the air.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what he said.
Okay.
My assumption is that there's probably a lot of questions that leaves open.
Yeah.
It was like, what does it mean to meet the Lord in the air? What does it mean for the dead in Christ to rise first?
What is he referring to when he says the coming of the Lord?
Yeah, I think I want to answer all those questions, but I think like what we need to remember is that we are only listening on half the conversation here. And Paul, assumed his audience knew what he meant in such a way that it would encourage them.
Yeah.
And so I think the really it's like there's so much speculation that goes on. What does it mean to the day of the Lord? What's the coming of the Lord? What does it mean to meet him in the air? It's like the point Paul is communicating is actually very, very clear. It's like, hey, you're worried that your dead friends won't join you when Jesus comes. Don't worry about that.
Right.
The dead are first on Jesus' mind. Why?
Yeah.
Because he died and rose again.
Right.
They're closer to eternity than you are.
Yeah.
Like, of course he's going to save them.
That's right. They died for suffering. That's Jesus's like home base, man.
Right. He's going to come for them.
Priority.
And we
in
will
his head.
all together experience Jesus's victory.
That's right. Neither the
His
living
coming.
or the dead are disqualified by either state from joining Jesus
That's
on
right.
his day.
That's right. So
Yeah.
that is what he wants to give them.
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Jesus
That's right.
who rose, death is no problem for him.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Because we'll probably because 2 Thessalonians is going to bring up some of these same categories.
Well,
and we're probably going to talk about a lot of this in maybe a separate episode.
Well, 1 Thessalonians brings it up again in
great.
just a second.
Oh, wonderful.
So when the coming of the Lord that they're afraid their dead friends missed out on. Well, now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, of what? Of this coming of the Lord that we've just talked about. You have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. So it's interesting here. He's
Quoting
like,
Jesus.
He's quoting Jesus from Matthew 23, 24, and 25. And he is also putting this in conversation with the conversation he's just had about the coming of the Lord, right? So apparently, Paul did have some time to talk about the coming of the Lord with them, but not full enough time to explain what happens to the dead when they die before the coming of the Lord.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have known to expect it at all.
That's right.
Or that it would come like a thief in the night.
Right.
They've had a conversation about the coming of the Lord.
They just didn't know some of the mechanics.
What
and
about the dead?
specifics. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
So he says, okay, we've already talked about when this coming will happen, right?
And the answer is, we don't know, like a thief in the night.
That's right. That's exactly right. We don't know. It's going to come like a thief in the night. What we do know is that people are going to be saying peace and security. People are going to assume everything's fine. But then that's when sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman and they will not escape. So he's also quoting Jesus again here from Matthew 24. But what's interesting here is like who's being destroyed in this case is probably the most pertinent question. And why would that be a conversation that they're interested in? My guess is, well, I'll save my questions.
Okay.
I'll save my guesses for later. He's just saying, okay, we know that God's coming and he's going to destroy malicious actors, right? At the very least, like people that are potentially harming you, or maybe even more on the nose, people that have killed your friends. We know that Jesus has come, and very suddenly, he's going to take care of them. He's going to do justice to them, just as we've talked about before. He's going to bring justice against them. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are children of the light. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and the helmet, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for a wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him together. So encourage one another with these things. So he's ending this very same way he ended that first section we just talked about. He says, we will be with the Lord forever, therefore encouraging another with these words about his conversation about the dead who die before Jesus comes. And he's ending this little section about the day of the Lord the same way. We'll live with him forever. Now encourage one another with these things.
Right.
Whatever he means here is for his people.
It's for encouragement.
It's for encouragement.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening here is on a very, on the most meta of levels.
Okay.
Is he's simply saying, when Jesus comes, the dead and the living will be with Jesus forever together.
Right.
Right.
Whether we're awake or asleep,
Mm-hmm.
everybody gets to be with Jesus if you're in
Right.
Christ.
And now we don't know precisely when that day is going to come.
Nope.
It's going to come like a thief in the night.
But it should only come like a thief in the night to those who don't know it's coming.
Right.
It'll surprise them, but you guys will be like, "Hey, Jesus, we were waiting for you."
Yeah, you're aware that it's going to come suddenly. So
Yeah.
when he comes, it's not really going to be a surprise,
Yeah.
but it will be a
Yeah.
surprise.
I didn't know it was gonna be today, but I was expecting it.
I was expecting it. So how should we live then?
Yeah.
Not in anxiety
Right.
over the fate of our fallen friends.
Yes.
But soberly, in expectation of inevitable salvation
Right.
that Jesus Christ has secured by dying and rising from the dead.
Yeah.
How do you live in the in-between, between now,
Right.
between the suffering you're experiencing now, and the ultimate victory and coming of the Lord? Not anxiously.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ has conquered death. He's going to come. Put on your, as a helmet, the hope of salvation.
Right.
The hope of inevitable salvation.
Yes.
And put on as a breastplate faith and love. So it's like, what is he telling him to do? It's the same thing he's telling him throughout the rest of the letter.
Right.
While you're suffering,
Yep.
act in faith and love towards those who are persecuting,
Yes.
with the hope that Jesus Christ will come and you will live with him together along with your dead friends. And you'll live with him. That's
Yeah.
all you need to know. That's what he wants them to know. That's what he wants them to feel.
Yeah.
Right?
Which, what a great message, not only for people who have lost loved ones, right? And we're curious how to process death in light of the resurrection of Jesus, but also what an encouragement to people who are currently suffering,
That's right.
right? Like, it's great news for the bereaved and the persecuted to guard your minds with the helmet of hope that Jesus is coming. So whether you are living or dead when that happens, he will avenge the wrongdoer and he will be with you who have been waiting for him.
That's right.
I mean, that's encouragement.
That's super encouraging,
Yeah, that's
right?
encouragement.
That's super encouraging.
Yeah. Wow. So what else in 1 Thessalonians do we need to talk about before we leave it?
I think the only thing that we need to talk about is what we didn't talk about.
Oh, I mean, that makes sense.
And I think intentionally didn't talk about. I think when people come to these chapters in Thessalonians, what we really want to know is like, so when is Jesus going to come back? When is the day of the Lord? What does it mean for Jesus to come down from heaven and us to ascend to him? We didn't talk about what any of those things mean in specifics. And that's kind of intentional. One, because I think there's so much speculation that ends up having to happen. Your interpretation of those passages depends on your interpretation of several other passages of Scripture. And it seems like we don't have time to do all that right now.
Sure.
Maybe we will in a later podcast episode, but for now it's like we don't have time. But the other thing is like Paul's main concern isn't to satisfy our curiosity about some of the specifics of the end of time,
Right.
but to encourage grieving people.
Yeah.
And so
And to give hope to the persecuted.
and to give hope to the persecuted.
Yeah.
So if we take away, if we did this podcast and ended up talking for an hour and a half about those details, we would have done Paul a disservice because he wants to give good news to the grieving and to the persecuted.
Yeah.
And the good news for the grieving and the persecuted is that Jesus Christ will vindicate you. He will avenge you against those who have done you wrong, and you will most certainly live with him forever.
Right.
There's like, and that's it. Like that's the ultimate hope of these passages. However it happens, whenever it happens, this is what he wants to give to his people.
Yeah. And the application that Paul makes is not, so get it all figured out, what it's going to look like, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, the sequence of events in which it's going to happen. That's not his application.
No.
His application is stay awake and be sober-minded.
Yes.
Right? Which means what? Put on the helmet of hope and know it's coming.
Right.
Put on the breastplate of faith and love and know in your heart that Jesus is who he said he is, that he rose from the dead, he's coming back, and then live in love with the world as an image of that faith until the day you die. Stay awake.
That's right.
Like, that's his application.
Yeah.
Is like, live the theology. Don't just like figure out all the days and times and everything.
And just to name it, what we've just read is incredibly confusing. So much so that Paul's second letter has to clear up confusion the Thessalonians had about the first letter.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Isn't that amazing?
That's very good.
So if we have questions, Paul's going to attempt to answer them
Yep.
in the next letter anyway.
Well, great.
So we'll have our chance to have our fun with those questions.
Well, wonderful. Well, is that First Thessalonians?
That's First Thessalonians.
Awesome. That has been really encouraging, and I guess that's its point.
That's right.
All right. If it hasn't been, we missed the mark.
We missed the mark, yeah.
Yeah. Well, be encouraged that no matter what you're going through, living, or if you die, or those who have died, Jesus is coming, and that should provide us comfort no matter what we're going through. That's very encouraging. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us in 1 Thessalonians, and hopefully you will join us as we move forward into Paul's second letter to this church, 2 Thessalonians. We'll see you there.
Thank you for listening to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Spoken Gospel creates short films, devotionals, and podcasts like this one. Everything we make is free because of generous supporters like you. To see our resources, visit spokengospel.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. See you next time.